Welcome back to the Controversy Corner, Boils and Ghouls. In this series, we examine lawsuits, frauds, feuds, and other unsavory events having to do with the comic book industry. And this episode is a special one. Arthur Suydam was once one of comics' most promising and respected artists. After decades of working his way up the ranks from a teenage hire at DC by Joe Orlando and reaching underground prominence with his work in both Epic Illustrated and Heavy Metal, Arthur Suydam finally reached the pinnacle of the industry after his work on Marvel Zombies in 2006. While a number of things helped Suydam stand out on the stands at the time, his knack for contorting the images of some of comics' most famous covers into bizarrely twisted and humorously grotesque homages would both skyrocket him into stardom and be the eventual cause of his downfall as well. It wasn't long after the massive success of Marvel Zombies, which Suydam did with Walking Dead scribe Robert Kirkman during his own rise to superstardom, that Suydam began to seemingly self-immolate. Suydam regularly began being accused of a host of sordid deeds almost immediately following his rise to prominence after nearly 3 decades in the industry, mostly stemming from his liberal usage of elements and compositions from other people's work without proper accreditation. As a result, it would be less than 10 years later that Arthur Suydam was basically run out of the comic book industry proper by an angry mob of fellow industry professionals fed up with his ego and antics, and a growing number of disillusioned and angry former fans who had began to increasingly resent a number of things about the once prominent artist. One of the biggest names in modern comics for a brief time, finding out exactly what happened to Arthur Suydam, why he seems to have completely vanished from the public eye, and more importantly, why, was not easy. But tonight I present to you the full story of Arthur Suydam's troubled comic book career. So join me in this multi-part documentary series as we examine the surprising meteoric rise and eventual equally epic downfall of Arthur Suydam, the so-called Zombie King, and another tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia I like to call Arthur Suydam, the Controversy King. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hog smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of exclusive behind-the-scenes updates, uncut interviews, early access to content. You can even get your name in the credits. You can also use the Ko-Fi link in the description to make donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, and if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. After a variant for Dark Wolverine and the conclusion of Marvel Zombies Returns in December of 2009, followed by Merc with a Mouth in September of 2010, Arthur Suydam's 15 minutes was definitely up. A lot of us couldn't believe how long it had lasted. But before long, Suydam was back at work on books like the infamous 2010 Howard Chaykin reimagining of Rawhide Kid, where he provided 2 covers, which were unsurprisingly movie homages again after the complete disaster that was the Marvel Zombies Returns covers. After nearly 4 years of non-stop work, people seemed to be totally burnt out on Suydam's increasingly lackluster work, and the artist himself seemed tired. His work was increasingly less and less detailed, and more simply seemed entirely uninspired. Suydam only produced 3 covers and a single pinup illustration in 2011, 1 ratio variant for Marvel Zombies Supreme, his last Marvel work for quite some time, and then a cover for Zenoscope and a cover and an interior illustration for Dynamite. If 2011 was slow, 2012 was dead silent for Arthur Suydam, who it seems was increasingly falling out of favor with a number of people as sales slumped and his massive ego continued to grow. Time was finally catching up with Arthur Suydam, and after years of constant work following the Marvel Zombies explosion in 2005, 2012 would be the first year in more than half a decade that Suydam didn't have so much as a pinup illustration published that I know of. By 2013, while Suydam did have some work published, he'd been reduced to working on titles like Nazi Werewolves from Outer Space. Now, mind you, I have nothing against that series, but it is as low rent an affair as the name would imply, and rather than an actual illustration in the book, there was a back cover illustration of a zombified Hitler by Suydam, which was obviously one of his notoriously rushed convention hatchet jobs. That single, poorly reproduced convention sketch in the back of an independently published comic amounted to the once great Arthur Suydam's single credit in 2012. Trying to make ends meet, Suydam began trying to peddle his art in other circles, contributing 2 covers that I know of for the Misfits and a few other random jobs here and there in graphic illustration and design. I don't know if they commissioned it or they had it lying around from some previous series or proposed title, considering how many Marvel Zombie sequels there's been, but Marvel did publish a zombie variant for the 2013 relaunch of X-Men. The series seemed to either be part of an abandoned idea or project, as it didn't feature zombified versions of a classic Marvel cover or a movie poster, though. No, it wasn't original either, though. It was a zombified parody of the Beatles' Abbey Road album cover. I remember getting a massive headache staring at that cover, just wondering what the hell Marvel was thinking, keeping Suydam on the dying zombie fad. And I was worried they were going to try a whole run with album covers then. Truth be told, though, outside of random zombie and homage covers of whatever they seem to come up with at any given moment, it really feels like Marvel just didn't know what to do with Arthur Suydam outside of this type of tired gimmick, which, trust me, after more than 8 years, was completely played out. While Marvel Zombies had been dying a slow death for some time, again all pun intended, and the Suydam X-Men variant did little to get anyone excited, The Walking Dead, on the other hand, had exploded in popularity. The television show, which started in 2010, had brought an entirely new audience to the comics as well, and Robert Kirkman was enjoying a career he could only dream of a few short years before while still on Marvel Zombies with Arthur Suydam. Arthur Suydam, however, found himself increasingly pigeonholed, typecast, and becoming a relic in an industry that thrives on the flavor of the month. As the comic ceased publication, he had an increasing amount of free time on his hands and needed money coming in. Suydam began ramping up his personal appearances at conventions. He'd been a regular staple of conventions for a long while, but the more time he had on his hands, it seems like the more shows Arthur Suydam did. Although people were becoming increasingly disinterested in his work and his spotlight was definitely fading, this didn't stop Arthur Suydam from trying to single-handedly take credit for the success and popularity of The Walking Dead. Quote, "Based on the success of Marvel Zombies, it's Marvel's best-selling trade of all time. I'm told that's what helped push The Walking Dead to get signed by AMC. To me, The Walking Dead is a continuation of Marvel Zombies." This is despite the fact The Walking Dead started publication years prior to Marvel Zombies. But Suydam's claims may be because of the way Suydam viewed The Walking Dead comic, going so far as to say at one point during an interview, quote, "So you didn't exactly know where the comic The Walking Dead was going at that time." Quote, "I had never read it. I knew of it. To me, it was a small, fan-produced black and white product. There's a bunch of those." The interviewer then asked Suydam if he had, quote, "worked on any of Robert Kirkman's comics before," to which Suydam suddenly seems to change his tune about the book and respond, quote, "Just The Walking Dead. I'm doing variant covers right now. How many I'm going to do remains to be seen. I've done one so far. We'll see where that goes." It takes a talented man to insult and try to take credit for something in the same breath, but Suydam seems to always be up to that task. And just for the record, that quote, one variant Suydam did for The Walking Dead wasn't for Image or Robert Kirkman. It was actually a Wizard World exclusive and for the St. Louis, Missouri convention, one of Wizard World's smallest events nonetheless. And also, if you're wondering, no, Arthur Suydam didn't do any subsequent Walking Dead covers or covers for any of Robert Kirkman's other numerous and incredibly successful books, despite everything that he did for Robert Kirkman, making his small, independent, black and white zombie book a successful TV show and all. As the Walking Dead show continued to gain in popularity, apparently gluttons for punishment, Marvel has always decided to try for some of that derivative dough, though. Having learned their lesson with Marvel Zombies Returns, it seems, or at least a lesson, namely that Arthur Suydam was not enough to sell audiences on a series alone anymore, and that with Robert Kirkman obviously not coming back, Marvel instead partnered Suydam with perhaps the most legendary name when it comes to zombies of all time, actually, George A. Romero. I literally don't know how you could be unaware of who George A. Romero was, or his importance not only to film and pop culture in general, but to horror specifically. Romero directed the original Night of the Living Dead and is the man essentially responsible for what's widely regarded as a zombie today. Prior to Romero's Night of the Living Dead, the stiff-armed, shambling, nightmarish denizens that make up such a large part of the horror culture today simply didn't exist. If Suydam, or more accurately Robert Kirkman, was the zombie king, George Romero was the zombie god. Given Romero's legendary status as the progenitor of modern zombie mythology, it only made sense to pair Romero with Suydam, the progenitor of the zombie craze. At least it made sense to Marvel. I don't know exactly who they were making the book for or even marketing it to at this point, and honestly, I don't think they did either, considering how poorly the project was handled. Empire of the Dead wasn't very well thought out and was obviously rushed into publication as Marvel scrambled to regain some control over the zombie market. If the series itself underperformed, which it did, then Suydam's covers seem to have completely bombed. Originally announced as providing covers for all 15 issues of the series, which was to be published as 3 5-issue miniseries, Suydam only ended up contributing B covers to the first 5 issues before Marvel summarily dropped Suydam's covers, despite continuing on with publication of Empire of the Dead following his dismissal from cover duties. While there was never any official reason given for this, and only weeks prior to his removal from the series, Suydam had touted to a local news affiliate that the series had been optioned and was destined for television sets across the US soon. Suydam's disappearance may have been in part due to the rather unflattering kind of attention that Suydam's work was beginning to attract, especially online. There was a group of people who obviously hadn't liked what Suydam was doing for years, and had been looking for a way to take him down a peg or two for a while. As Suydam continued to linger like a bad taste in people's mouth around the periphery of the industry, another factor that may have led to his removal occurred a few months into his Empire of the Dead cover run. Bleeding Cool ran another article in March of 2013, and much like their original Art Swipe article from 2006, the article showed Suydam's Walking Dead cover painting next to the obvious reference which had been used, in this case a still shot from The Legend of the Seeker. There was no denying the image was a dead ringer for Suydam's composition of Rick Grimes on the cover. Normally this kind of stuff isn't even discussed. It's not as though everyone in the industry draws images directly from their brain like many assume, but people seem to be intent on busting out Suydam at any and every opportunity that they got. While interpreted as simple jealousy at first, before long, the true reasons for this type of hyper-aggressive behavior towards the artist would become rather clear, though, with the internet making it easier than ever to track down the sources his paintings were being assembled from, and an ever-increasing number of people doing just that following the Walking Dead cover. Many began to wonder just how much of Arthur Suydam's work had been lifted and traced from other sources, and it quickly became something of a hobby for certain people to track down arms and legs and different elements from other compositions and paintings that Suydam had used over the years. And to be fair, it was a shocking amount. There were Frazetta legs and arms all over the place. Entire layouts and designs were lifted from other places. It was rather disturbing as time began to pass. And if declining sales and waning job offers weren't bad enough, once people started tugging, they entirely pulled the veil off of Arthur Suydam's carefully constructed system of digital composition, projection, and tracing. Yet again, it seemed this could be, and at this point probably should be, the end of Arthur Suydam and his troubled comic book career. This wasn't the case, and though he would eventually manage to weather the Walking Dead cover troubles, one thing he never managed to escape was the growing throngs of other professionals who, for one reason or another, wanted Suydam out of comics once and for all, though, as I've said, those reasons will become clear shortly, I think. The earliest online reference that I could manage to track down, pointing out how obvious Suydam was about taking elements or entire parts of other people's work, is the 2006 Bleeding Cool Swipe File article concerning the Superman convention print that Suydam straight ripped off of a Bill Sienkiewicz painting and then tried to pass off as his own. While it's only a convention print, it is importantly not a Marvel Zombies cover. This is important because while Marvel asking for homage covers was constantly offered as a reason, or rather as an excuse, as to why Suydam hadn't composed many, if any, of the images which had earned him so much prominence in the industry so quickly and been subsequently paying the bills since he started work on Marvel Zombies in late 2005. Only months into his Marvel Zombies run, the Superman print makes it abundantly clear that Arthur Suydam was absolutely guilty of liberally borrowing from other people's work, most likely even prior to Marvel Zombies, as I've said, though those are usually elements and not entire compositions, and this is despite claims from Arthur Suydam supporters to the contrary this entire time. While Sienkiewicz actually had a run-in with Suydam in 2006, right around the time the article was published, showing just how nice of a guy Bill Sienkiewicz really is. At the time, he hadn't responded to the article or made a big public fuss about his personal feelings towards Arthur Suydam. Following some hilariously bizarre events in 2015, however, this would all change. Despite what convention flyers and promotional photos would have you believe, by 2014, Suydam seemed to be taking any work he could get. There were basically only two companies that hadn't turned their backs on Arthur Suydam following the nosedive in popularity of his Marvel Zombies and work in general. As I've said, behind the scenes, even while he was being celebrated as the toast of the town, there was an increasing number of people who wanted nothing more than to see Arthur Suydam forcefully ejected from the comic industry by any means necessary. While Suydam might have you believe that this was because other people were jealous of the success he had eventually managed to find with his homage covers, in fact, this couldn't be any more of a fabrication, and there were indeed several reasons, especially other industry professionals, had come to resent Arthur Suydam. While this would eventually all shortly come to a head later on in 2015, one of the other major precipitating factors in Suydam's ejection from comics had actually originally occurred years prior in 2010, but hadn't really received a lot of attention or media coverage until 2015. The complete Cholly and Flytrap collection. As easy a task as simply chronologically collecting stories and reprinting them might seem, it does come with its own set of dangers and pitfalls, many of which Arthur Suydam seems to have fallen prey to. One of the big selling points of the collected Cholly and Flytrap was that it was going to feature remastered art for the series, which it did, but definitely not in the way most fans of the original work had hoped for. Rather than simply cleaning up the pages and doing better transfers of the art, the coloring was tweaked and cleaned up, dialogue was needlessly changed, and there were even entire pages made up of art which Suydam digitally cut and pasted together to make new ones. While there were plenty of people puzzled and even a little peeved about this, there was something that few people picked up on and even less discussed when the complete Cholly and Flytrap was originally released by Radical Entertainment in late 2009 or early 2010. In the series as it was originally published, all of the weird, insane-looking characters were mutants and monsters basically created by this toxic environment that they lived in. In the 2010 version, all of the dialogue was changed in order to insinuate that they were actually just people in masks and costumes running around this post-apocalyptic landscape for some completely unexplained reason. There were also other seemingly more needless changes made to the story, which had necessitated the new pages, despite the fact that they added little to the story and Cholly and Flytrap still didn't really make any sense. While all of this seemed a little needless to say the least, it wasn't an inordinately big deal. As the months passed and more people pulled out their original issues of Epic Illustrated to compare it with his new collection, however, people also discovered that Suydam, who is as famous for his portrayal of the scantily clad female form as anything else, inexplicably decided to paint extra clothing on many of the female characters throughout Cholly and Flytrap. This is a strange move for a man who literally spent several years working for Penthouse to me. While they might seem innocuous, and the book was his to do with what he wanted, these changes were generally likened to the type of censorship books often undergo when they're prepared for release in much more sexually conservative countries, and in particular, Saudi Arabia was a prime example given on a few occasions when discussing these changes. As annoying as all this was, it wasn't the end of the world. The colors didn't quite look right, the story had been changed up, and the sexuality toned down, but it was another change Suydam had made to the book, which really got people worked up. The Cholly and Flytrap series, which took place and was written over a period of years, features a number of characters who are homosexuals. It's not a huge statement on sexuality or anything like that, but there are a number of gay characters and a central love plot that takes place between two men in the series. While there's not an inordinate amount of stuff out there that deals with this type of subject matter, Suydam had been associated with a number of the more prominent gay and bisexual characters, even following his reemergence in comics post-2005, including Hellstorm aka Hellstrom and the Rawhide Kid. He wasn't a spokesman for the LGBT community or anything, but he had seemed to have kind of a forward-thinking and accepting view of those types of characters, considering he had written and had virtually complete control over the Cholly and Flytrap series. Because of this, when people opened up the book and subsequently discovered that the main thing that had been changed wasn't just extra clothes on women, but that a great deal of the dialogue which had been changed was apparently done in an attempt to entirely remove the homosexual love affair subplot that I referenced. This had been done in an incredibly apparent and awkward manner, and once they managed to cobble together the reason for the confusing and poorly reworked dialogue, then people were cheesed off. The gay love affair between the champ and Wilmer wasn't necessarily even removed, but Arthur Suydam did his best given what he had to work with. Any dialogue that referred to Wilmer, an obviously effeminate homosexual male as portrayed by the art, as such or even as a man, was changed in a rather pathetic attempt to trick new readers into believing Wilmer was actually a woman, thereby making the love affair totally kosher and politically correct. I know I said it before, but it's important to remember Arthur Suydam wrote Cholly and Flytrap himself. There was no one forcing him to put any of this stuff in his books. Suydam had chosen to include gay characters in the series under his own volition. Given that it had been a choice on Suydam's part when the series was originally being published by Epic Illustrated, many wondered if Suydam had somehow been pressured into changing the book, perhaps in an effort to somehow make it more homogenized and commercially viable. There didn't really seem to be any other explanation for a man of Suydam's credentials. Suydam had treated the sexual preference of the characters with such seeming indifference. This sudden change felt out of place to a lot of people. To others, it was simply another sign of the changing face which Suydam was taking on following his Marvel Zombies work. While there were few that took Suydam to task about this at the time, in the one article that announced these changes to the world at the time on a mass media scale written by Bleeding Cool, it was also made clear that author Rich Johnson could, quote, confirm that this was a creative rather than an editorial choice, which made the whole thing all the more confusing. If Radical had requested the changes, okay, maybe, but why, after all these years and now finally with the freedom to do whatever he wanted, why would Arthur Suydam willingly choose to change his work in such a way? In the painful, long, and self-aggrandizing introduction of the complete Cholly and Flytrap, it's revealed that the series was born mainly from two places. The first was Suydam's inability to gain acceptance or understanding from the people he worked for early on in his career, namely at DC. But interestingly, this introduction also references a number of stories which were submitted to and summarily rejected by Warren as well. It seems that in fact this is the reason Suydam never worked for Warren. While Jim Warren might have liked his portfolio and offered him a job, once he started actually turning in work, it was quickly decided that Suydam didn't fit well with the publisher, and it was all rejected for one reason or another, although the introduction does go on to heavily imply what this reason was. It's also revealed that Suydam was having an insane amount of material that he completed rejected for use by DC at the time as well. While I can't say for sure about Warren, it's basically spelled out that DC's refusal to run his stories was due to the rather, quote, adult content of his stories more than anything else. These statements, taken with Suydam's insistence he had remained in independent comics because of the artistic freedom that it allowed him, despite the smaller paychecks, made his choices to censor the Cholly and Flytrap series in not one, but several ways, and the actual things he'd chosen to change all the more perplexing. Although Suydam has spoken inordinately highly of DC editor Joe Orlando, the man that ushered him into professional comics and who Suydam has claimed he chose to work with over Warren, who had, quote, already hired him, I think this is more a fanciful reimagining of how things actually went, though. Rather than simply taking too long on his stories and being busy with school, it sounds like Suydam was actually becoming something of a pariah that no one wanted anything to do with because of the outlandish and controversial elements of his stories from almost the moment he entered the industry. This would go a long way in explaining the excruciatingly few stories that Suydam ever had published during nearly the first decade of his work for comics, especially if it's true how much umbrage Suydam took to editorial interference on any level when it came to his books. Given that Suydam saw himself as an auteur, there wasn't a lot of talking to him, and rather than choosing to work in independent comics, I think the truth is that Suydam was relegated to second-tier companies and titles because he absolutely refused to play nice with anyone that so much as disagreed with how his work should be produced. The introduction to Cholly and Flytrap goes on to say that this stance of refusal to submit to the man with a capital M and the general rebellious attitude when it came to shunning outside interference or influence that the artist adopted was an integral part of a sort of a comic book renaissance, which took place following Suydam's arrival in the pages of Heavy Metal and Epic Illustrated. While I suppose subjectively this might be true, not only are these facts extremely exaggerated for the purposes of this introduction, it seemed to drive home the nagging question of exactly why. After all these years and all this supposed effort he had put into not submitting to censorship and the money he had missed out on, why all of a sudden had Arthur Suydam seemingly chosen to censor and homogenize his own work? It wasn't at the request of anyone at Radical, and Titan didn't get involved until the re-release of the same content some years later, so they couldn't have had a hand in it either. While the introduction of the book repeats over and over again Suydam's unwillingness to compromise or change his work for a greater level of mainstream success or money because his editors at DC and apparently would-be editors at Warren simply didn't get what Suydam was going for. They didn't understand his genius and he was unwilling to compromise it. That's what they drive home over and over again. They tie this into how he became a titan among the comic industry because of these tactics, and how he was an indispensable part of the evolution of the medium which had taken place in the nearly 4 decades he had been involved with it. When combined with the art that Suydam himself had apparently altered and painted over in an effort to make it less sexual and possibly less offensive, as well as completely change sections of dialogue in some sort of whacked out attempt to whitewash the homosexual characters and aspects of Cholly and Flytrap he himself had written, the introduction simply did not make sense. The entire premise was preposterous, and that fact was proven by the needlessly castrated interior alterations, which to this day I believe Suydam has adamantly refused to comment on. While in 2010, when the complete Cholly and Flytrap was originally released by Radical to a somewhat underwhelmed and limited audience to say the least, there weren't an inordinate amount of people who even took notice, or if they did, who cared. When the complete Cholly and Flytrap was subsequently repackaged and released by Titan several years later in 2015, however, well, considering what came next, to say it was awful timing would be an understatement. The book proved to be the equivalent of Arthur Suydam painting a gigantic kick me sign on his back. By the end of 2015, it seemed Arthur Suydam had overstayed his welcome in the business. The zombie craze was over, major publishers like Marvel had long since stopped calling for work, and following stories like the D-Gang of Cholly and Flytrap, as it was referred to, even former stalwart holdouts like Zenoscope and Dynamite probably began to realize working with Arthur Suydam was as much a hindrance as a help when it came to selling the books and especially marketing them. With the whole Cholly and Flytrap debacle still fresh in everyone's mind following the Titan re-release of the book shortly before this, almost unbelievably, it was a convention appearance that would finally absolutely destroy whatever remnants of Arthur Suydam's prominence remained. Now, if you've never heard of Tablegate before, well then, honestly, you're not missing much. To be very fair, it seemed like a small thing got blown really out of proportion, at least at that particular convention, at least at first. As details continued to emerge, they began to paint Suydam in a rather unflattering light, to say the least, and seal the fate of his reputation to this day as a smug, egotistical man who, while pleasant enough to deal with if you're buying something, can be downright nasty human being. Right around the Titan re-release of the complete Cholly and Flytrap, Suydam made one of his many convention appearances. Since his work had taken off with Marvel Zombies, Suydam had become something of a staple at conventions all over the country, where he would sell his prints and verified signatures. In July of 2015, Suydam made what seemed like just another convention appearance in Montreal. He showed up the night before to set up his tables, or rather have his assistants set it up for him. As I've said before, because I think they'd become simply one of the only major sources of revenue for the faded artist by this point, Suydam was a convention regular. It probably also helps he seems to love attention and adoration, because conventions were and still are such a big part of what he relies on to actually pay his bills. Suydam went all out when he made appearances. He apparently does pay to rent out several tables, but accordingly also expects to be comped extra tables on top of this so he can accommodate his massive banner and expansive setup. When Suydam and his assistants arrived the day prior to the convention to set up their booth in advance, there was something of a snafu. Suydam was displeased with not only where he was located, but the amount of table space that he was allocated. Following something of a temper tantrum from most accounts, Suydam demanded that several other artists' entire setups, booths and all, be taken down and relocated so they didn't infringe on his space. While the staff weren't happy about it, after a lot of back and forth, they decided to acquiesce to Suydam's request and relocated several artists' booths and displays, tables and space that they had paid for. And to make matters worse, this was apparently done completely without their knowledge or consent. Despite the early troubles, once the displays were moved and the convention got underway the next day, all seemed well. That is until when the other artists booked for the convention showed up and headed for their designated booth areas. Space which they had paid for and was published in the official guide to the convention, which allowed fans to find the writers and artists that they were looking for. After a few people talked to the Montreal Comic Convention staff and put together what had gone down with Arthur Suydam hijacking their space, all hell began to break out online almost immediately. It started out with a short, somewhat cryptic tweet from a comic creator named Jim Zub, who for the record is the man Arthur Suydam is referring to as a, quote, fan artist in his response to this situation. Although the first tweet was short and far from specific, it didn't take things long to erupt into all-out warfare. While Zub originally simply tweeted, quote, to all of you asking how things like this happen and why shows put up with it, I've seen this heel do this at 3 to 4 other shows. While obviously ambiguous, if you weren't intimately familiar with the unfolding situation at the time, this initial tweet was followed by several others in rapid succession throughout the first day of the convention, with each successive message seeming to grow both more specific and more aggressive. The second tweet read, he just shows up early, sets up his gargantuan booth, and takes down the signage for people next to him. No regard for anyone else. While the third, which came shortly after, the shows don't stop him, so he just continues his ego-fueled awfulness year after year. While obviously pissed off, Zub still hadn't named any names. And it seemed this might just be an upset artist with an axe to grind with another artist for whatever reason. Zub, however, then posted a picture of Arthur Suydam's booth and table set up right across the way from his own, thereby clearly identifying Arthur Suydam as the culprit he'd been referring to all day. If that wasn't enough, Jim Zub fired a final shot, captioning the photo, quote, hey everyone, look at this massive booth at the show I'm at. It's much bigger than other booths in Artist Alley. Without corroboration, this could just as easily have been a petty vendetta between Zub and Suydam for reasons that we as a public weren't privy to. Zub could have just been jealous of Suydam and felt like taking some pot shots at him. As it turned out, however, this was not the case. And Jim Zub wasn't the only artist who had been affected by Suydam's demands when it came to his booth and table space. As the weekend unfolded, and these other artists also became aware of the problem, the proverbial shit hit the fan. As well as Jim Zub, Canadian editor and colorist Rachel Ritchie, well-known artist Dan Parent, and renowned DC artist Francis Manipool, as it turned out, however, had all had their tables moved to entirely new sections of the convention without their knowledge or consent prior to the first day of the event. While Zub was the only one who took to Twitter with his complaints that day, Francis Manipool apparently was not pleased about the situation when he found out about it either, nor was he afraid of talking about it. When discussing the entire affair later, Manipool said this, quote, to be honest, I wasn't aware of the situation until more than halfway through the first day. I was shown to my table by one of the organizers who I know to be a really great guy. I asked how his day was, and he let on about a disastrous situation. He seemed stressed out, so I didn't press him and just pointed out that there's nowhere to go but upward. When I got to my spot, I saw my nameplate on the table rather than hanging behind like all the other creators' nameplates. I didn't think much of it, and since there wasn't a line, I took the opportunity to say hello to fellow creators. During that time, Rachel put up my banner and a line formed, so I sat down and proceeded to sign books. Throughout the day, I got a lot of confused, relieved people who approached my table and told me tales of their long journey. I just replied my location should be in the book. Unbeknownst to me, I was actually in the wrong spot because I had been displaced by Arthur. I just thought, weird. Rachel and some other creators made me aware that the previous night, Arthur had taken down my name along with her own and Dan Parent's and moved us to another location in order to set up on ours. My reaction was honestly mixed, as I thought the whole thing was just so bizarre. Seriously, who does that? It's like coming home to find your neighbor parked in your driveway. So I told Rachel I was going to go talk to him, but she didn't want me to ruffle any feathers, so decided not to. Then a minute later, I was on my way to his table. I just could not let it stand, even though Dan and Rachel were already set up and didn't want to rebuild again. However, it's the principle of the matter, and I wanted him to know that it wasn't cool. I was still confused whether I felt angry or, much like the guy who finds his neighbor parked in his driveway, generally perplexed. I was thinking, something's just not right about this guy. His behavior didn't make sense. I got up to the table and simply said hello, to which he very politely and quite cheerfully greeted me. I was caught off guard as this nice older man spoke to me in a polite and respectful way. Now, anything I said that wasn't as polite in return would make me look like a total asshole. So I just said, "Hey dude, this is actually my table you're sitting at. You look pretty set up here, so that's fine. However, I've had a lot of people telling me they've had a very hard time finding me. So if you see confused bystanders around your booth, would you be able to tell them my location?" Which he agreed to do. The whole thing just felt weird because he neither apologized nor broke character of his polite demeanor. He didn't seem to be aware of any wrongdoing, and at this point, I just wanted solutions rather than an argument that went nowhere. Granted, it was a dick move, but what followed seemed like a tad bit of overkill to me at the time. Before Arthur Suydam or anyone in his camp even really had a chance to respond, the internet was on fire, with tons of other industry creatives sharing their own unpleasant convention experiences having to do with Arthur Suydam. Ron Mars made several public statements about how this kind of behavior shouldn't be tolerated because it gives the entire industry a bad name. And apparently Ron Mars felt pretty strongly about the subject too, going so far at one point to refer to Arthur Suydam, the self-proclaimed zombie king, as, quote, Arthur Douche King Suydam. Mark Waid, much like with the Robert Granito situation, absolutely hit the roof as well, saying if Suydam even attempted anything like this at a convention he was attending, that Waid would personally make sure everyone and their mother knew about it, and agreeing with Mars that this type of behavior was unacceptable and gave the entire industry a bad name. At the time, I thought it was a bit of an overreaction, but as stories which spanned years began to emerge of countless other creatives who had virtually the exact same experience began to come out, it became clear that Suydam's naysayers, while perhaps a little overzealous, seemed to have a very valid point about the artist's entitled and childish antics. For all the accusations slung at him, the archived tweets, forum, and Facebook posts, and other social media, if you search today, the only thing you'll come up with as far as a response from Suydam's camp is from his manager at the time, Renee Witterstaetter. While Witterstaetter's response is all you'll come up with today, as it turns out, Arthur Suydam had in fact responded almost immediately with his own delightfully unapologetic explanation of what had actually happened. Upon doing this, or more likely upon Renee Witterstaetter, who had to have known what a buffoonish move this was, discovering what he'd done, Suydam and Witterstaetter instantly then got in touch with every media outlet he'd sent the message to, demanding that it be taken down. If you're wondering what Suydam's response to all of this was, and how he tried to so simply explain it all away, well, to be honest, his callous and condescending attitude towards everyone involved seems to go a long way in explaining how this whole thing ended up blowing up in his face so badly in the first place. And to be clear, going into all of this, I honestly felt like this had been totally blown out of proportion. I mean, like I said, he might have been a total dick, and he might have acted like a child, but he was getting eaten alive on the internet. And until I finally managed to track down his original response, I didn't really get it. When I read it though, a lot of things started to click, and many other artists' opinions of Suydam became much more clear, as well as seemingly justified in many respects. In his original response, Suydam attempted to clarify things in a rather smug and pompous manner. Quote, The Montreal show changed its floor plan on Thursday, the day before the show. However, they didn't send out notification, and only the 5 American artists at setup time on Thursday night knew of the table placement floor plan change. The next day at showtime, the Canadian artists unfortunately began hearing from a singular troublemaking fan artist who wasn't there at setup, who began spreading fabrications to the artists and online that the American artists at the row end were taking their tables, and guess who that lucky artist on the end was. The fan artist wasn't in the loop on Thursday, so he knew nothing. This is the guy who sat across from us all weekend long at his table with no fans and no one paying him any attention while the crowds flocked to the Americans' tables. Then the low IQ online crowds, too lazy to check facts, more interested to turn simple misunderstandings into an opportunity to create some trouble, jumped in. Also adding that, quote, the show promoters have since come out and corroborated these facts, end quote. Yeah, I told you. I don't know exactly how this was supposed to diffuse the situation rather than simply stoke the embers of outrage that were already threatening to ignite all around him. Just as when he was a child, Suydam was playing with fire and still seemed to have little idea of the repercussions of what was about to take place. This response, even once it was recalled, seems to have absolutely infuriated a number of prominent creatives in the industry, and with most sites prominently stating the fact that it had been recalled at his request, it also upset a lot of people online with way too much free time on their hands, like me. Arthur Suydam, or more likely Renee Witterstater, was acutely aware of the repercussions that this response could have, and attempting triage as best as she could, Witterstater quickly issued her own, more tactful, if still completely unapologetic response. While Witterstater left out the insults about other artists and didn't brag about Suydam's art selling more than anyone else's, Witterstater still laid the blame for the entire table mishap that had led to this situation solely on the convention organizers, who, for the record, even Francis Maniple, who was obviously pissed about the situation, had nothing but nice things to say about it, and even mentioned how distraught staff seemed to be when he arrived stemming from this incident. According to Witterstater, however, quote, in response to the posts about the Montreal Comic Con this weekend and the table placement for artists at the show, let me state that I am the booking agent for a group of artists including Michael Golden, Arthur Suydam, Mike Zeck, and others at the convention. When we arrived for the setup on Thursday, there was a snafu with the table setups for all the artists. In order to correct the problem, everyone was moved. The Montreal Comic Con, much to their credit, stepped in and found solutions for all the table placements so that all artists had their agreed upon table amounts. No changes were made without the show's knowledge, and no artists made any arbitrary changes on their own. Any artists there for setup were informed of the changes, and we assume others were told as soon as they could be. In the end, none of us were where we were originally supposed to be on the map, but it appears that all the fans found us anyway, and everyone has had a great time at the event. So anything else being said about this situation by third parties is simply spreading untruths. We'd like to thank the Montreal Comic Con for their support and willingness to fix the situation, and most of all, thank the fans that come to see us at the shows. It was unbelievable. Witterstater thanked the organizers for being so kind and understanding, but spent the entirety of the rest of her message blaming them for the problems which had occurred because Suydam demanded more tables. And for the record, despite both Suydam and Witterstater's emphatic statements that the entire situation was due to mistakes made by convention organizers, a fact which they had supposedly publicly acknowledged, the only public statements that the Montreal Comic Con convention organizers ever made, even approaching admitting any wrongdoings in this situation, was simply that, quote, yesterday there was an unfortunate situation where certain creators were displaced from one area in Artist Alley to another area in the same alley without their knowledge. We at Montreal Comic Con offer a sincere apology to those affected. We have spoken to the creators and have reassured them that they will be compensated for the inconvenience. In this situation, Comic-Con assumes a measure of responsibility and has taken certain action to ensure that this type of situation will not be repeated at any of the events we manage. That's how you deal with this situation. This seems far from an open admission of wrongdoing, as both Witterstater and Suydam claimed, however, and more seems like the convention organizers trying to apologize to the displaced artists and make it clear that the situation that had taken place would never be an issue going forward with the Montreal or any other convention that they handled in the future as a result. On top of this, according to Witterstater, quote, no artists made any arbitrary changes on their own. This is in direct conflict with numerous eyewitnesses who saw Suydam's staff take down Zub, Parent, Maniple, and Richie's displays, even going so far as to note they weren't extremely careful about doing so. This teamed with Suydam's referral of Jim Zub as a, quote, fan artist were the last straw for a lot of people. And following the second statement by Arthur Suydam's management, Bill Sienkiewicz finally decided to share a story he'd been sitting on for a while, and I think sums up pretty much exactly what Suydam had been up to, how he'd been treating his fellow artists, and why people were so quick to dogpile on him during and even after what became known as Tablegate. While he'd remained silent on the subject since 2006 when it occurred, apparently that Superman print that Arthur Suydam had cribbed off of Sienkiewicz's painting had bothered him. A lot, in fact. And that hadn't been the only problem Sienkiewicz claimed to have had with Arthur Suydam, which he addressed in one of his famous Facebook posts, saying, quote, one of the bits of buzz I was informed of at San Diego Comic-Con this year by Neil and Buzz the Artist, as a matter of fact, was something I'd only heard of marginally on social media. I'd missed it due to deadlines and prepping for the show. I'm not much for the jump on the bandwagon school of bashing fellow pros. Comics and illustration is a tough field, a tough life's choice to pursue, and I give props to anyone trying to make an honest go of it. Keyword here is honest. Left is a 30 by 40 inch painting I did in the early 90s for a Superman exhibition in Nebraska. Right is a print for sale by this other guy. By the way, Soup's thighs are courtesy of Frank Frazetta. Being the kind of guy he is, Sienkiewicz refused to even mention Suydam by name for fear of helping him somehow. Quote, I'm not going to even say his name. While he refused to give him any free publicity, inadvertently or not, Sienkiewicz did have one final thing to say, this time directly to Suydam, and I think he was summing up a lot of people's feelings at this point when he said, quote, just shame on you. From here on in, it was all downhill for Arthur Suydam, who seems to have been digging himself a pretty deep hole for quite some time, because unbelievably, Sienkiewicz didn't stop, explaining the situation around the Superman print even further in one of his responses in a comment on the original post. If he'd been polite and gentle in his original post, he was anything but in this response. Quote, honestly missed the whole Tablegate thing, Mishigas, though when I heard of what he'd done, I wasn't surprised. I'd been the recipient of his convention booth kudzu at many a New York Comic-Con. I used to get phone calls from convention organizers telling me that he had specifically requested booth space immediately adjacent to mine. Guessed he wanted to draft off my fans. I'd arrived at between 10:30 or 11:30 a.m. at my booth, and every single day I'd find his merch all over my booth and table space. Not cool, I'd say, and his response of a laugh and a wave and a just keeping it warm for you failed to elicit any smile from me after the second day or again on the third. I just felt messed with and disrespected. I treated this guy as a peer, a friend with respect. This is confounding. I don't particularly care to understand what motivates this behavior. I told all showrunners to keep us separated, end quote. Witterstater, who had been Suydam's agent at the time and appeared to be as such only a day before, on July 14th, subsequently tried to explain this new situation while simultaneously still covering her own butt and at the same time distancing herself from what was becoming an increasingly toxic situation playing out in front of millions of spectators on the internet. In a comment on Sienkiewicz's Facebook post, Whitterstater attempted to clarify the earlier Superman print situation. Quote, "I wasn't going to chime in on this since I'm not Arthur's agent. Bill and Arthur are both my friends and I'm trying to actually work today, but I was Arthur's agent when this piece was done over 10 years ago. At the time when Arthur realized the reference he'd been given was based on your piece, Bill, he approached you at a convention and paid out of pocket everything he'd made on the piece, which was $300. You said you hadn't even seen the piece and thanked him and took the payment. So perhaps this is the first time you're seeing it? It was a long time ago. I remember this vividly because there was then a discussion about if Arthur was going to pay my agent fees or not since he didn't make a profit on the piece. He did end up paying me as well, even though he didn't have to in this case. That's the backstory that I know. I don't know on what planet Whitterstater thought this was going to be any kind of legitimate explanation, let alone excuse for Arthur Suydam's behavior, but this was a terrible misstep on her part. First off, even if they did pay Sienkiewicz $300, which Suydam claims is all he'd made off the piece, that means he should have stopped selling it right then and there, knowing it was taken from someone else's work, but he didn't. Instead, it feels more like the $300 they paid Sienkiewicz was more like hush money. If this wasn't bad enough, Whitterstater had come out and in not so many words made it clear that there was a system in place for this type of situation. There wasn't a discussion about what to do. They seemed very nonplussed about it and calmly approached Bill Sienkiewicz with a handful of sweaty hush money in a not-so-subtle attempt to keep him from going public or making a big stink about the situation. The way Whitterstater tells it, it's like Arthur Suydam was doing Sienkiewicz a favor, paying them when he didn't have to. From this comment on a random Facebook post used as a supposed explanation of Suydam's better nature, it was extraordinarily clear the type of situation that occurred with Sienkiewicz was not something new or unique and had taken place before. This proved that while Arthur Suydam might not have been getting called out for it online back when he was at the height of his Marvel Zombies fame, he'd sure as hell been lifting images from other people's work, playing them off as his own, and then pleading ignorance and or paying people off whenever he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Digitally manipulating photos and even tracing over reference images was one thing, but directly stealing another artist's work, that's a horse of another color. When you start getting publicly called out about that, well, people tend to get a little bit personal, and that is exactly what happened. Of everyone that Arthur Suydam ended up pissing off with his antics this time, however ironic it might be, it was the ever outspoken and when angered absolutely visceral Erik Larsen that would deal the final blow to Suydam's fragile ego, shattering the poorly maintained facade he'd been living for nearly a decade at this point. I think knowing that perhaps the table situation was being rather blown out of proportion in this case of the single Montreal convention, rather than go on some tirade about Suydam stealing tables in one of his own appearances or a story of his own, or even other people's art, Erik Larsen hit Suydam where it really hurt. The ego. With conventions being his main source of income, Arthur Suydam had pushed them increasingly, especially on his personal website. The now defunct site listed his numerous accomplishments and published projects, as well as featuring a small gallery of images having Suydam at these said conventions. There were massive lines and small quips about how much of a draw Arthur Suydam always proved to be, further encouraging anyone interested in booking him for live appearances to do so. A man of many talents, his ever-astute eye and keen wit both came into play when Erik Larsen issued his own questions of legitimacy concerning Arthur Suydam's images, but not his paintings, pinups, or even his notorious prints. Larson instead pointed out that there seemed to be something off about the promotional photos that Arthur Suydam had been using to promote himself and his numerous public appearances to convention organizers. The main image in question wasn't just a promotional photo either. It was the promotional photo. The photo Arthur Suydam had used for years to prove how much of a draw he was at conventions, all pun intended. This was a fact Emerald City Comic Con founder Jim DeMonaco's directly confirmed via a tweet saying, quote, he routinely emails that image as proof that he is the #1 draw in all of comics. Larson supposed that the images had been doctored to make Suydam's lines look more impressive than they actually were. For a man who relied so heavily on these appearances, this would be a devastating blow, and Suydam's camp immediately attempted to deny any accusations of photoshopping or image manipulation in a Bleeding Cool article from the day the story broke. Quote, as to those allegations that promo photos have been doctored to add more people to his lines to bulk them out, they state that, quote, no photos have been doctored in any way as can be attested to by anyone that has seen Arthur at any show. To suggest otherwise is laughable, end quote. As it happened, what was laughable was Suydam's belief that he could outrun this one. These images were out there. He had been spreading them around for years, and they were about to come back and bite him in a big way. It took 4 random people, usernames Toronto Joker, Hat Tip, Cav, and a guy named Jamie Colville, less than a day to not only prove that the images had been doctored, but they went a step further. They even managed to track down the original photographs of fans which had been used, with irrefutable proof published and absolutely nowhere to run any longer. Arthur Suydam made a real bitch move, in my opinion. Again, instead of just apologizing, admitting what he'd done, moving on and learning from it, he issued yet another statement of absolute BS less than 24 hours later. The gall of Suydam's response is almost unbelievable. Quote, thanks for bringing the photo to our attention. I'm on the road with no internet, but if that's the one I'm thinking by the description, that's a rather old one that one of my former assistants pulled off of the internet. Probably a pic that a client was using to promote an appearance. I liked the photo because it was a side view and showcased the fans as well as the convention experience. It seemed representative. We had no idea anything in the photo was apart from the original. Since I do have a lot of folks visiting, especially on Sunday when I do free sketches for kids, we do that at all shows and offer other promotions as well. I just assumed it was one of those days. Maybe, just maybe, if Arthur Suydam hadn't already outed himself both through interviews and his own cover work for Marvel over the past few years as being so knowledgeable and even capable of digitally manipulating images himself, his plea of ignorance might have worked. That, however, was not the case. Given the fact that people started coming forward with more examples than I can even begin to recount here about Suydam's skill in digitally manipulating images, like the time that Arthur Suydam evidently basically took a photograph of a Marvel Legends Deadpool action figure, put it through some filters in Photoshop, and released it as the cover to Merc with a Mouth 4. He had nowhere to turn at this point. If you look closely at the Merc with a Mouth cover, you can even still see the joints from the action figure in question. I mean, it was just astoundingly lazy work. It wasn't hard to pick out, and by this point it seemed indicative of not only his work but his life in general. Even the photos that he used to promote himself were a lie. It felt like nothing about Arthur Suydam was real. His entire existence began to feel like some sort of grand illusion that he'd managed to conjure up and keep going for far too long now. Suydam had said only a few years prior in 2006, quote, the truth is not a gray thing. None of this spin bullshit we see so much of today, end quote. And he repeated this sentiment in interviews for years. Had he not been so erudite and outspoken about stuff like this, I doubt he would have been taken to task like he was. As it was, however, the world was about to have an absolute heyday with Arthur Suydam's career. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know if you really enjoyed what you saw. Make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere. Again, if you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, updates, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel, if Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and make sure to select the tier and the perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. And you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting Service, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I seriously want to thank every single one of you that supports the channel and helps make these videos possible, with a super special thanks to my loyal Wednesday warriors, Channel 10, Chasen, Clinton Salvini, and Mike Dolan. I really hope the quality and content is getting better, and I can't wait to see where this next year takes us with your continued support. Thank you again for helping this crazy dream of mine become a reality, and for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep it in those local shops, and keep reading comics.